Hello, I'm Glenn Fahey, Director of Education here at CIS. Successful schooling begins with classrooms that allow all students to learn. But all too often, students are not in calm, orderly, and well-controlled classes. The result? Disruption, misbehaviour, and students not reaching their learning potential. Many students' behavioural challenges simply go unaddressed, harming their future prospects, while also taking a significant toll on teachers, principals, and parents. Sadly, the picture's getting worse. On the OECD's indicator of school discipline, Australia ranks at 70th out of 77 school systems. 2 in 5 students say their classmates don't listen to what their teacher says. And nearly half say there's noise and disorder in most or all lessons. We must get classrooms back under control if we're to turn around education outcomes. The good news is there's already a playbook for success. With the right tools, preparation, practice, and support, all teachers can successfully run even the most challenging rooms. So to discuss running the room and building a supportive school culture, I'm pleased to welcome back to the CIS, Tom Bennett. Tom is director and founder of ResearchEd, a grassroots teacher-led movement that helps teachers to become more research literate. Tom also serves as advisor to the UK's Department of Education, especially leading its Behaviour Hubs project. He's also the author of Running the Room, The Teacher's Guide to Behaviour. Tom, thanks for joining us.
What a pleasure it is to be almost back in sunny Australia. Greetings from rainy Scotland.
Naturally, wouldn't have it any other way. Look, Tom, they call you a behaviour czar. What's a behaviour czar?
A behaviour czar, thanks for that. A behaviour czar is an entirely invented position. I'm the government's behaviour advisor to schools, which is far less glamorous and sexy. And the minute it was announced, the paper said, new government behaviour czar. Announced. And I thought, well, that's quite groovy. I quite like that. And then the next day, I heard people saying, who does he think he is, calling himself a czar? And I just thought, oh yeah, now I understand how the media works. So essentially, it's an advisory position. It's an independent advisory position. So I get to say what I want to them, as it were. And if I'm lucky, they adopt some of my stances. But it's very much an advisory role. But unlike a czar, I don't actually have any power. it's purely a kind of a glorified soapbox, but by God, I'm very honoured to have it.
Well, we're very glad that the soapbox brings you all the way to CIS here in Sydney. So we're pleased to have you in that role. As we set up this discussion, we've got to get, I think, some definitions and some understanding out of the way, because the discussions around classroom management are really tied up in a whole lot of similar related concepts, things like behaviour management, classroom management, the learning environment, relationships with the student-teacher relationship, habit formation, discipline. Are all these things part of the same concept, or are they different things entirely?
I mean, they're all different words, and which means they all mean slightly different things. I think what I find fascinating about behaviour management discussions is that because the public discourse about behaviour is often quite infantile, and I'm going to choose my words carefully here, it's quite infantile, and people think that when you talk about behaviour in schools, you must mean, like hitting children with straps or something like that. And it's because that behaviour management hasn't really been studied or particularly well propagated internationally as well as nationally in the UK, that we get tied up with these definitional problems and so on, because behaviour management is about relationships. But that's not enough. You can't just stop there and say, oh, it's just about relationships, because people make all kinds of mistakes under that auspice. It's about managing the space that you're in. It's about making sure that schools are safe, which is massively overlooked, making sure that they're calm places where everybody can learn. It doesn't mean they're always quiet, but the default should be calm. And there are also places where everybody is treated with dignity, including the staff. And when you put those three things together, that's the type of school culture we're looking for, which requires behaviour management, because behaviour has to be managed. And I think this is something which has been massively overlooked in the past, century, when it comes to educational philosophy and educational practice. There's this crazy idea that if you somehow just kind of step back, children will just naturally behave, that they naturally want to learn, and that they naturally want to learn what you would like to teach them, which is, of course, rubbish. And whenever anybody says this to me, I feel like saying, have you ever met a child? They're wonderful. They're everything you could want them to be. I love my children. They're the centre of my universe. But they are not, natural mathematicians. They don't sit down thinking, I wish I could learn some more Pythagoras. They're little agents of chaos, and they need help, scaffolding, and support to usher them into maturity, both the maturity of conduct and maturity of intellectual process. But perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. But yeah, I mean, the definitions of this drive me mad. Can I just say, if you talk about discipline, people go mad because they think that you mean, starving them or hitting them with a stick. And it does have that connotation, of course. But there are other connotations or denotations of the word. I mean, discipline can mean self-discipline. It can mean the ability to stick to what you said you were going to do, being self-disciplined, having, strong willpower and sticking to your guns. And I think that one of the reasons I tend not to use the word discipline is just because it gets so mixed up and messed up in that fuzzy word cloud that people can fall into. And the same way, if you say discipline, people hate it. If you say sanctions, they hate it a bit less. If you say consequences, they hate it a wee bit less. So terminology does matter. I think it's important to realise that when we're talking about classroom management, we're talking about helping children succeed. We're talking about helping children to be safe. We're talking about ways of helping children to understand how to learn better. And these are all great things. And I think if we pursued that, and if we talked more about that in behaviour management, then a lot more people would understand and be a lot less scared of the whole subject. But I'm going to stop talking now.
But this, I think the fact that you point to some of those trigger words there, discipline does invoke a set of associations that as you say, can result in misunderstandings or even, objections from some people within education. But I think what you're getting at there is that there is a matter of ideology that matters here too, about fundamentally identifying the role of students and teachers and how learning happens. And I think it seems to me that there's a critical role there when we talk about the facilitator of learning versus the director of learning when we think about teachers' roles. Clearly, that's got to have that ideological starting point. How does that influence the way that people think about behaviour, classroom management, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, ideology is a powerful drug, and let me just say, it's very difficult to escape an ideology. If people say I have no ideology, they frequently have them when they're just not aware of it. A long dead philosopher, as somebody once famously quoted. And I think when it comes to behaviour management, a lot of people don't think about behaviour management a lot. I mean, why should they? I mean, they probably should, especially if they've got children. And because of that, they're not really aware of how it is that you can manage and direct the behaviour of other people. In fact, if I'm honest, we're normally quite bad at managing and directing our own behaviour and understanding our own habits and our own triggers and how to form habits. And so because of this, fairly understandable general lack of awareness of behaviour in general, it leads people to come to some fairly erroneous conclusions. So for instance, when you look at, classic 19th century progressivism, which is, many people might be unaware is where a lot of contemporary educational philosophy comes from. There's this idea that children naturally want to learn, that children should be the enablers of their own education, and that we should kind of put things in front of them and step back. And miraculously, they're going to read Dostoevsky and stuff like this. And of course, it doesn't work like that. And actually, weirdly enough, empirical science and the work of people like Geary and Sweller, native to your own isles, are very, very good at unpacking and exploding this myth that children are just naturally curious and they just naturally want to learn. They do up to a point. They like to learn simple physics, and they like to learn simple language, and they like to learn simple social skills. I mean, little kids, toddlers are very good at picking this up. But beyond a certain point, the type of stuff that we're interested in them learning, like complex higher order social skills, complex higher order mathematics, complex higher order English and science and so on, this isn't stuff that we're naturally inclined or prone to wanting to learn by ourselves. And if you leave a child to their own devices, don't be surprised if they continuously pick the thing that is most pleasant, the thing that is most intriguing, the thing that's most engaging to them, rather than perhaps sometimes the thing which is most important for them to learn in order to get better at something. And learning is hard. You know, I mean, we're talking to an audience full of people who I'm sure have been through multiple steps in education. It's hard to learn stuff. It doesn't just come naturally. You can't just put it in your headphones and fall asleep and let it wash over you. And good behavior is actually a complex web of tiny little social skills. You know, the ability to put your hand up, the ability to know how to wait your turn, how to share, how to be patient, how to be kind, and all of these things. And these are skills, and these are taught to you. You're not born with these skills. These are complex social skills. Now, if you're lucky, you'll have been immersed in a very nurturing environment where you'll have learned lots of these skills from the cradle. And you'll know how to say please and thank you and be kind and be generous and wait and be patient and share and all that stuff and take your turn. But if you're not, or if you've had a less nurturing environment, you'll get less of this. And what I find quite maddening is that often people say to me, oh, but children just naturally behave. And you inevitably find that these people have come from an extremely privileged environment, surrounded by extremely privileged people, having gone to an extremely privileged school. That taught nothing but the sons and daughters of Swiss diplomats. And I even get teachers saying things like, oh, this behavior, it's so easy. You just ask them to do something and they do it. It's wonderful. And presumably in these schools, everyone's jumping on their chairs and shouting, oh, captain, my captain. But I've got news for you. In the vast majority of schools, it's not like that. And you see a wide range, a huge spectrum of behavioural output, because you see a huge spectrum of children from lots of different circumstances and different socio-economic advantage and so on. So you cannot guarantee that these skills are taught to them. These skills, these social skills have to be taught to children. That's what behaviour management is. And if you teach a child that doesn't have these skills, and you're a teacher, it's up to you to teach the behaviour curriculum, not just teach your subject.
So help us to paint the picture that you've alluded to the fact that obviously classrooms differ just as individual students differ, just as schools differ. What are the sort of markers that you would say that differ between a classroom that is well run, orderly, and one that's not? What are some of the markers that stand out to you, having seen hundreds, thousands of classrooms?
How long have you got, Glenn? I see now that you're more interested in my 10-minute answers than my 30-second answers. So what are the markers of a well-run classroom? Okay, first of all, one of the main things is that when you walk into a well-run classroom, you'll see that there are routines and processes in place, that the teacher has got a really clear expectation of what good behaviour looks like. Now, most teachers, when they enter the classroom, because their teacher training and induction was probably not very good, and I'm saying that quite confidently because, like MC Hammer, I've been around the world, from London to Dubai, and I've seen lots of school systems, and haven't seen any country that's got this licked yet. I assure you, this isn't just a crack at Australia. We're trying to resolve it in the UK, but we're getting there slowly. And in a well-run classroom, you'll see the teacher with a very clear definition of what good behaviour looks like, not just what they don't want to see, because that's important. It's important to know what you don't want to see. You must have boundaries. But it's also really important that the teacher says, this is how I want you to come into the room. This is what I need you to do when you walk through the door. This is the level of volume you're supposed to be at. This is your uniform if you have a dress code. This is the equipment you're supposed to have. This is where I want you to go. This is what I want you to do. This is how I want you to put your hand up and put your hand down. This is how I want you to ask to leave to go to the toilet. This is what I want you to do if you're stuck or you're sad. This is what I want you to do when we're going, and so on. And that you systematize and make routine these processes, which often we can just leave to be chaotic. And when I watch a really well-run classroom, you often don't see anything happening at all that strikes you as strange. You just think, yeah, this is a really nicely well-run, everything's fine. Nobody's misbehaving. But what you don't see is that those habits, those behaviors have been extremely carefully inculcated into the children, whereby they've been taught these processes, they've been taught these habits of behavior. Because children are all different, and they've all got different expectations of what you should do and what good conduct looks like. What the teacher's done is grabbed all these threads and said, what? This is what good behaviour looks like here. Not because I'm some kind of fascist oppressor, but because I love you or I care about you in a professional way, and I want you to succeed. And how well you do matters to me. And because of that, These are the systems and processes we're going to have in this classroom. And I just think that this is so misunderstood. You get people who say, "Oh, behaviour management, you must be some kind of tyrant. You must be some kind of fascist." Let me tell you this: I've got 2 small children, and my wee boy would run into a motorway to catch a squirrel if it took his fancy. He's lovely, but he's very impetuous. And my wee girl, if you let her, would stay up till 2 o'clock in the morning, eating ice cream and reading Harry Potter. Again, I don't blame her. I would too. But the reason why we are adults and we're there for them is that we've got to set these adult boundaries for them in order to scaffold their growth. So in a well-run classroom, that's exactly what you see: scaffolded boundaries, but not just boundaries, instruction manuals of what to do within those boundaries. Because life isn't just a series of don't do this, it's a series of do this. And if I want you to drive a car properly, I don't just say don't hit things. If I want you to learn German, I don't say don't speak French. I teach you to drive a car. I teach you to speak French. And we need to teach children the behaviour curriculum. This is how we're going to interact, as well as just, but you also mustn't do this. There's a bit of both going on there. But you drive it with the positive aspect, I would say.
Jenny asks, regarding the behaviour curriculum, is it something that needs to be bespoke for every classroom, or something that's just generally applicable? Something that's negotiated with all students? I guess it comes to the point you were noting earlier that of course all students come to you with different backgrounds and so on, but to what extent does the way we can manage behaviour differ according to the differences in students' interests, expectations, and what they've come to school with?
That's a great question. Was it Jenny? That's a great question. I think that when it comes to a school, I think I'd be very wary of individual classrooms being completely separate subcultures, because a school is a community, and a community needs to run on common expectations and understandings of how we're going to interact with one another. So a school will have whole school expectations, and it might be, whatever, equipment or uniform, or walking on the left-hand side of the corridor, or how we behave in an assembly or in the canteen and the dining hall and so on. So there's that. There might even be some whole school cultural, social skill expectations for how we behave in a classroom. Some. So for instance, the school has got the right to say, lessons will run roughly like this. I expect you to register the children in the first 5 minutes, or something like that. That's perfectly fine. When it comes to the individual classroom, though, the classroom teacher is still, in my opinion, free to add more subroutines of social expectation within that classroom, depending on the year group, the subject, the skill, the age, the phase, and so on, and also the needs of the children to some extent. So if it's an art class, you might have a different protocol for equipment than a sports class or PE or something like that. So it can be, there in fact needs to be some level of personalization at the classroom level, but there also needs to be a very strong adherence to the whole school cultural expectations. And my suggestion would be that I've seen schools and classrooms run very, very differently and still be very, very successful. I'm a huge believer in the plurality of the education system. I think it's brilliant that schools are different. And I celebrate that. So, I've been to schools in Finland, and it's all, cuddles and beanbags and high fives and first names of the teacher and so on. They're all chest bumping each other. Fine. That seems to work fine culturally in that environment. And then you go to classes in Singapore, they're often quite different. And, and I'm happy for schools to be mega strict and schools to be laissez-faire, as long as everyone is calm, safe, and flourishing, doing well academically and socially. Schools can be very, very different. But what unites these schools, and this is one of my big studies in 2017, was that what these schools do have in common are very clear, commonly understood expectations. So these expectations could vary from school to school, but the expectations were very clearly understood by staff and by students alike, and that these standards were continuously upheld by all members of staff and all students, obviously with reasonable accommodations made for children whose circumstance lead them to be unable to meet those expectations. That's very, very different. But in general, there are very, very high common expectations for all. I hope that addressed the question.
So I suppose if I was to take that, you're effectively saying there's a set of running the room sufficient but not conditions or necessary conditions that may not be sufficient in order to guarantee well-behaved classes. Would that be right?
That's a very logically philosophical way to put it. I love it. So, for example, it doesn't matter to me if your kids line up outside the classroom or they come straight in. But what matters to me is, do they know what the expectation is for that behavioural process? Because there might be lots of, there's pros and cons for lining up and pros and cons for coming straight in. So something as simple as that. Do you want them to line up single file or side by side? Can they talk or is it silent? Are they fixing their uniform or not? Are they getting a homework diary or not? What do you want them to do? Tell them, teach them, and make it clear to them, and then insist upon it every single day? Or do you want them to come in, self-register, get some Duplo out of the sandbox, start an essay, do some work in the board? What do you want them to do? Fine by me, but make it clear what you want them to do and then systematize it. And my advice to any classroom teacher is, where you've got a behavior or a sequence of behaviors that you just need every single day, that you don't want to deviate from particularly, like how they come in or how they leave and so on, then systematize it, make it a routine and teach it to them and constantly insist upon it until it becomes a habit. And once it becomes a habit, it becomes them. Because I don't want kids thinking about, how do I come into a classroom? I want that way, way back in their unconscious. I want that just to be something they do habitually. I want their conscious bandwidth to be freed up to think about art and music and poetry and science and so on. That's what I want them thinking about. I don't want them thinking about, where does my bag go? Which is where lots of conversations and arguments happen in classrooms about things that should have been systematized right at the beginning of the relationship.
So we've talked a little bit about what a good classroom, a well-run classroom looks like, but particularly for those that might be watching this that maybe haven't been in a school classroom for many years, what does a disruptive classroom look like? What are the sorts of things that are characteristic of a disruptive classroom? So I highlighted in the open that many Australian students say that their peers don't listen to the teacher when they're giving instruction, that rooms are noisy. We know there's also increasing statistics about even violence in schools impacting upon school staff. Is that characteristic of what you'd call a disruptive room or a school culture that's maybe not working well?
Absolutely. And I think something that, depending on your audience right now, if you're working in a challenging school, none of what you said will be surprising. That will be, yeah, of course that happens. That happens all the time. Whereas if you've been fortunate enough, and I hope many people have been, to have gone through a really positive school experience, that might not sound like your school whatsoever. But sadly, and this is something I've studied quite comprehensively, this is really, really common. And it's far more common than people think. And a lot of people would be horrified at the types of behaviour they see in schools. I mean, at its most extreme form, and forgive me for saying this, in the UK schools, there are 200 rapes a year, right? Which, I mean, I can't begin to get my head around that. And that's at the extreme end of it. At the less extreme end, there's very high levels of indiscipline and misconduct in schools. And it's not to say that schools are like Escape from New York or something. This isn't Mad Max Fury Road. Very few schools are like that. This utter chaotic cesspits of violence and so on. Although some are, a very small minority are. But when I talk about misbehaviour, I'm talking about schools where classes never get quiet. Teachers can't be heard. They just tend to persist with a small group of students who really want to learn. Corridors are chaotic, sometimes violent, and certainly unsafe and unruly. Kids bunk lessons constantly and so on. And these are the types of schools that I see on a weekly basis. And I see some brilliant schools too. So when you talk about what are the characteristics of a chaotic classroom, I would suggest that the chaos is far more normal than order. And that from a social point of view, it doesn't happen by itself. People do, I'm sad to say this may offend some of the more communitarian members of the audience. People just do not naturally organize into large complex social groups of easily agreed rules. These rules have to be explicit and they have to be maintained, and that conduct needs to be taught and behavioral skills need to be taught, generationally or interpersonally. And in chaotic classrooms, kids, this is the thing that drives me mad. In chaotic classrooms, kids are not safe. They're not safe from bullying, abuse, victimization, or many other forms of harm. In chaotic classroom, kids are not learning very well. There is a tiny fraction or percentage of children who can probably, get by in a noisy classroom. The vast majority of us are massively distracted by distractions. And I'm glad you were sitting down for that. Shocker. Mm-hmm. The learning is massively disrupted in chaotic, noisy classrooms. In chaotic classrooms, kids are more vulnerable. Teachers want to leave. Kids don't want to stay. Kids play truant. Kids hide in the corridor because of chaotic classrooms. When we get this wrong kids get punched in the face. When we get this wrong, kids live lives of misery, hiding in toilets from people who shame and bully them. When we get this wrong, children's life chances are devastated. And it's the least advantaged children who suffer the most. It's children with special educational needs who suffer the most. It's the poorest who suffer the most. So when people come to me and say something like, oh, why do you want to oppress poor children or something like that? I feel like laughing in their face. And I would laugh were it not so tragic, because these people are so misguided about what children need and how to help children flourish and learn and grow and be safe. And if you care about children at all, you care about classroom management. Steps off his soapbox.
But to that point, I suppose there's evidence that shows that the chances of students being able to successfully meet thresholds for proficiency and even completing school are so intertwined with the experience they have at school. And of course, those that suffer attentional difficulties and behavioural challenges are clearly the ones that have much more difficulty as you reach the more senior years. But what are some of the markers even earlier on in school? So I want to now get a feel for between primary school, between secondary school, what are some of the markers that we might be able to identify in students that might put them on a trajectory, maybe early on, that might put them on a path to be someone who's likely to be well-behaved or maybe have more difficulty later on?
I mean, there's loads of risk factors which are concurrent with lack of later life success. And most of these are connected to, let's face it, socioeconomic circumstances. But these are, of course, risk factors. These are correlations. It is devastatingly unfair to somebody from a poorer background to say, well, you're poor, so you're not going to behave. I mean, it's a mockery of dignity to say that. But what we do know is that socioeconomic deprivation correlates very, very strongly to risk factors, which then correlate very, very strongly to misbehaviour at school. So I want to be absolutely clear about that. Otherwise, this sounds like some kind of rich kids are well behaved and poor kids aren't. Absolute nonsense. But if you come from circumstances of want, lack, neglect, or abuse, it's far more likely that you're going to inherit or inhabit habits of behaviour which are going to be suboptimal in a school environment. If you go home every night to a beating from an alcoholic father, and then you come to school the next day, it's very, very likely that you'll have developed what we might call antisocial traits. You might have developed, for instance, the habit of hiding, or lying, or being a people pleaser, or flattering, or being violent yourself, or whatever. There's a million different ways the human spirit can go. In fact, sometimes people can come through adverse childhood experiences and be extraordinary people. And we can't predict it because the human spirit is zephyrus in its nature. But what I will say is that when you get kids from those types of backgrounds, there tends to be lots of higher risk factors. So early on, if a child hasn't been given this nurturing environment, rich or poor, the school needs to try to help to provide that. Now, this isn't some kind of fuzzy, Montessorian philosophy of being their parent. What it simply means is letting the kid know that they matter, that you care about them in a professional way, that they matter to you, and that they're not just a number. Number two, let them know that their conduct matters and that you will teach them the conduct. That's why I call behaviour a curriculum. It's not just something to be kind of beaten into a child. It's something to be taught. And lucky kids are taught it from an early age at home or in their familial circumstances. And if they're not taught it there, then it's up to us to kind of do a bit of that teaching ourselves. And that might mean, very simply, being really explicit about what they have to do. This is how we stand in a queue. This is how we get our lunch. This is how we say please and thank you. This is what we do when we're stuck, and so on and so on. Teach these little micro-social skills and watch kids flourish. I mean, the vast majority of them are capable of learning these skills. And once they do so, they realise, this is how I do well. Because kids want to do well. They want to succeed. They want to be praised. They want to be liked and loved. They want to be accepted. So teach them the skills they're going to need to do so right from the infancy of their educational careers. And when you go to a really good early years environment or a kindergarten, kindergarten environment, this is 90% of what they're doing. They're teaching people how to, not punch each other, and how to process anger and process disappointment, and what to do if you're a bit sleepy, and these little micro skills. And a good kindergarten supplements a good parental environment whereby these kids learn these social skills. So kids who are on a track to not doing particularly well and later on in school careers are usually kids who haven't been taught enough of these social skills and or are never expected to do anything better. And this can come from quite affluent socio-economic circumstances too. Yeah, I mean, the spoiled child is another example of this. You know, the kid who always gets what they want, the kid who's never given a boundary, grows up thinking boundaries don't exist to them. And then eventually they become prime minister. But moving on. But children need, you know, these kind of levels of boundary. They need someone to say no occasionally, but they also need someone to say yes to this. And a lot of kids don't get that.
Tom, I want to get a bit more through what are some of the dynamics around behaviour and the way that this is perhaps changing. Is the issue around classroom disruption, of course, isn't new, but it does seem that issues about behaviour seem to be on the rise. Is that because behaviour is changing, or is it because teachers are today less capable or less able to run the room effectively?
It's because we are now in the age of Aquarius. No, it's this is a really interesting question because it's something that really animates me. You know, has behaviour got worse? People always ask me this. The difficulty is, now I'm going to talk specifically about the UK basis. The difficulty is we don't have any serious comparators to draw a meaningful empirical comparison across the decades. So it's very hard to say, yes, it's definitely got worse or it's definitely got better. I mean, that is a huge difficulty. And and I don't think it's something which is only shared by the UK. I think most countries have this difficulty. In addition to that, we have the problem that some of the indicators we have are very anecdotal. I mean, so and some of them we can discern from perhaps reading literature of the past. So, for example, it used to be back in the 60s and 70s in the UK that you would sometimes get schools where, I mean, kids were running riot. I mean, famously, some schools shut down because kids, you know, literally ruled the school day. They were allowed to go into lessons if they felt like it. I'm kind of just say this was by design. This was progressivism let loose. This was mad teachers and head teachers and local authorities saying, yeah, let the kids decide their own curriculum. Let them decide when to go. And these places became, unsurprisingly, like something out of Lord of the Flies. And teachers didn't want to work there, fancy that. So it's very, very hard to say that. I think there are different pressures on people's behaviours just now, for example, like social media, mobile phone issues and so on. But when it comes to, you know, has it got better or worse, again, it's hard to say. What I will say, though, is this, in terms of the reporting of it, traditionally, and this is something I've seen throughout, you know, many, many different countries, traditionally, the reporting of behaviour has been the province, has been the privilege of the people in charge of education. And it is perhaps, shall we say, you know, there is perhaps a perverse incentive here that when you are in charge of a school and you are being asked to report what's the behaviour like, it's very easy to say it's not bad at all, because nobody wants to say, yeah, my school is chaotic and unsafe. And in the UK in particular, I can talk with a lot more accuracy about this. This was exactly what happened. That the people who tended to gather the data on behaviour, and it would only be done, you know, once every 5 years or something, they would say, yeah, things are fine, thumbs up. And this was the message that was sent out that back in 1995, was it later than that? The Steer report said that 90 or 80% of schools had good or better behaviour. Wow, everything's fine. But the problem is when you interview teachers and students, people who never get interviewed, they say, no, this is pretty bad, actually, or the picture is quite variegated. And when you ask those kind of stakeholders, the answers are not often very, very different. And people, when they leave the profession, they say, oh, it's behaviour and workload and things like that. So obviously there's a big disjunction here. And I think what we're seeing now is an explosion in, I guess, free speech, an explosion in accessibility. Teachers getting onto social media and saying, man, what a day I had, and acknowledging this. And in my writing, when I started to really bang my drum about this in the UK, you know, I got an army of teachers saying, yeah, this is exactly what it's like, which is why in the UK, what we've done is, and I've been campaigning for this for some time, and I think it's going to launch next year, we're going to have the National Behaviour Survey. And students and teachers are going to be asked once a term and once a year, really simple questions about, you know, how safe they feel, what's the behaviour like, do they feel trained enough, and so on. And I suspect we're going to see some really, really interesting results from that.
So this, I mean, as far as markers go, what are the sorts of things that you would suggest that are good indicators that are actually measurable? I mean, that obviously so much of it is an anecdotal experience. So much of today is shared in parents groups or amongst teachers in the staff room, or perhaps students when they're older can reflect upon classrooms. I mean, unfortunately, some of the information that we have at a big picture level are things like the number of suspensions or expulsions, and we're meant to infer from that's is good behaviour management that you have more expulsions, that you act upon, you take action upon something, or is it that you have fewer because you're preventing them? Obviously, that's a really poor indicator. What are some of the good markers, though?
Yeah. Here's a big problem here, which is that when famously, when a measure becomes a target, that it ceases to have any value. And in the UK, what happened when I was a teacher back in about 1926, when I was a teacher back in the early 2000s, teaching for 15 years, there was a really, really strong presumption that exclusions were bad, right? If you excluded somebody, you'd failed them, and you'd failed as a school, and you'd failed as an institution. And a high exclusion rate meant that Ofsted, our National School Inspectorate, would come along and say, your rate's really high, you're a terrible school, wallop. And you would get this terrible grade, and head teachers would lose their jobs. Really, really high stakes levels of accountability for a measure like that. So the measure became a target. And what did schools do? They just stopped excluding. They still had the power to do it, but they stopped doing it, and they would keep kids in. This benefited nobody, including the non-excluded student, because they would exist in an environment where they weren't getting better either. The kids round about them were being victimized, abused, bullied, threatened, or worse. The teachers were being driven to the point of insanity by the extraordinary conditions they were expected to work within. And everyone just kind of chugged along with this, and it was never reported because the data never got out. So that's why asking teachers matters. And in 2015, 2016, our National Inspectorate called Ofsted, they did something which was actually really, really good for them, because traditionally they've been, I'm going to say, part of the problem. They published a report called Below the Radar. That was a great title. What they did was they surveyed lots and lots of schools and teachers, and they asked them some really intelligent questions, which were both qualitative and quantitative in nature, and which meant you could crunch the data to some extent. They asked them things like experiential questions, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how safe do you feel your school is? How safe do you feel? And then they asked them much more crunchy questions, like on an average day, how frequently are your lessons disrupted? How many minutes do you think you lose per hour dealing with disruptive behaviour? Now, a lot of this, of course, is going to be experiential. A lot of it, there's a high level of subjectivity there. But when you aggregate that across a cohort, you get, cleaner data, and you get, a better idea of the bigger picture, at least, rather than perhaps the granularity of it. And what it revealed was, I think they said something like, on average, and this was backed up by a London School of Economics report, that in an average school, kids were losing up to 1 hour of learning per day, which is like a day per week, which is a year per cohort of children. Now, you'll never claw all of that back, but you can claw a hell of a lot of it back through better behavioural systems, routines, and better classroom management. And I think those types of questions are really, really crunchy. So it's, as I frequently say when it comes to research in this area, it's okay to ask questions which are responded to subjectively and objectively, as long as you acknowledge the limitations of the response you get. But when you get high levels of teachers saying, yes, actually, I think behaviour is not safe here. No, I don't feel particularly well trained. I lose on average 45 minutes per day to misbehaviour. And then kids also back that up in their information. Then, you'd have to be pretty hard-nosed to avoid that level of triangulation of data. You'd have to be pretty obstinate, pretty stubborn, pretty much an ideologue to ignore that.
So there's almost a sense there that you've got really an orange and red kind of alert level, right? That once you're able to triangulate multiple sources pointing in the same direction, this is an opportunity that intervention might be needed from someone above it, whether it's inspectorates, departments, or so on, to provide additional support. That there's obviously something, particularly when it amounts to violence and so on, that violence is obviously a symptom of something else that's happening downstream. So what would be the threshold in your view? At what point is it violence, or do you intervene when you get a large number of teachers commenting, when parents are commenting, when students are coming out with low completion rates, you're not staying on very long? What would be some of the triggers that, I suppose, before things reach a threshold where it's insurmountable? What are some predictions maybe that would be suitable?
That is a great question, primarily because I haven't thought about that too much before. I would say off the cuff that that when teachers and students are reporting that they don't feel safe, that's your biggest red flag. You know, and if more than like 5% are saying that, then you know you want to go in there like the SAS, quite frankly, because that's extremely concerning. You know, everybody should say, yeah, I feel safe. You know, I might not be learning very much, but I feel safe, and that's your bare minimum. And even if there's any indication of that whatsoever, I mean, to be honest, in these types of surveys, you always get noise. Whenever you do a survey of people, you know, who believe in aliens, you always get 3% response rate, and that's just people, you know, screwing up the data, saying yes, not understanding the question, and so on. And maybe like one person that does believe that aliens, you know, rule the earth, and so on. In terms of, I mean, the reason why I'm struggling with this question slightly is because when you're a classroom teacher, if the behaviour is less than perfect, you should always be trying to push it up towards it. You'll never get there. It's like the promised land, but you know, but it's something you should always be trying to push towards. You should never settle and say, this is good enough, because when you settle, you're basically putting a ceiling of expectations upon the students. And if you're a school leader, I would say until everyone is saying the behaviour here is perfect, I will keep trying, which means you'll always keep trying. And this then turns into a broader national debate as to what type of intervention mechanisms should the state have, or should an inspectorate have, to do something about a school. Now, I would suggest that a school where, you know, safety isn't absolutely mandated is a school that should be closed. And I'm absolutely serious about this. Any school that doesn't take safety seriously doesn't deserve to have children. You know, like if you said to someone who runs a hospital, do you want people to get well? Mostly. No, you can't run this place. You know, you should want everyone to get well. Whatever that means, optimizing that in real life is a different matter, but you should want everyone to be well. And from a school perspective, if learning isn't happening because behavior is poor, intervention needs to happen. If safety isn't happening because behavior is so poor, then an intervention needs to happen. And there's a big debate about the difference between accountability and agency when it comes to inspectors. How tightly do you hold them to account? How much freedom do you give them? And my answer to that is very similar to the answer I would give to a teacher who's started off in their career. How much freedom do you give them? How much accountability do you hold them under? And a lot of people say, I want them to be professionals. I will give them all the freedom in the world. You know, let their poet soul sing. That's called in at the deep end, and that's how you drown people, right? You hold people far more accountable when they're less competent. And when they're more competent and they've evidenced that, then you can step back a bit and give them more agency, which is not unlike teaching a child how to ride a bike. If you can see them riding fluently and clearly, then you don't need to hold it on anymore. But if they keep falling over, then you hold the back of the bike until they learn balance. And that for me is the best metaphor for accountability and agency. And if you can demonstrate in evidence that your school is running well and kids are safe, and on an annual basis you can demonstrate that, and may I just say, a national behaviour survey is the ideal way of demonstrating that, then you know, the inspector could take a more light touch approach and visit you in a more light way. But if you are demonstrating high levels of lack of safety, chaos, unruliness, incivility, you know, bad language, you know, however you want to demonstrate it, then that's when you need to be visited by the inspector on an annual basis until you improve. And if you don't improve, then somebody else gets put there who can improve it. You know, and that's why this matters. As I keep saying, people get punched in the face, people commit suicide, people have their lives scarred when we get this wrong. So it's so important to get it right.
Issues around behaviour don't just start in the classroom, right? Some of them, many of the roots can be outside of the school gates. What are some of the things that happen at home that contribute to good or poor behaviour? And is there, taking a question from Mark in respect to that as well, are there elements about the way our culture is perhaps changed in recent years that's more fearful about potentially offending anybody, changes in our broader society in that respect? Do they impact upon an unwillingness perhaps to counter behaviour that's adverse?
I would say that when children walk into a school, they don't just suddenly spring into existence. You know, they drag their lives with them, and their lives are the products of their experiences up to that point. And children don't invent themselves. They're not Madonna. You know, they are very much the products of their lives. and the habits that they have formed. And their habits are their character. And character can, there's probably a genetic element to character, but you know what? I don't care about that because I can't do anything about it. What I care about is what we can do something about, which is how we nurture and raise children. So that's what I call character, the habits that they've been kind of taught as they've grown up. Now, as I said before, if you come from a fortunate environment, and this can be a poor environment, but it can be a nurturing environment, children can be taught really brilliant life success skills about, how to interact with people successfully, how to navigate being an institution successfully, and so on. And some children don't get this. So, for instance, so as I said, poverty is a really strong marker for the types of risk factors which we associate with misbehaviour. Because, for example, it's far more common in an extremely poor household for there to be less parental engagement, simply because parents have to bloody well go out and work and earn the dollar to pay the bill and pay the mortgage. And it's far more common in lower socioeconomic circumstances to see greater rates of alcoholism and drug abuse. Again, simply, and this isn't a kind of a simple causal mechanism. There are lots of factors at play here. Sometimes the alcoholism causes the diminished socioeconomic status. So, again, it's a complex mess. So, but these are definitely parts of it. And I'll give you an example. I taught in one of the poorest schools in London many years ago, and it was chaos. And it was my very first training school. And I remember thinking, holy smoke, what have I bitten off here? The very first lesson I worked in, there was a kid dealing skunk at the back of the class, which I'm informed is a type of a drug. And I'd just come from running nightclubs in Soho in London. I was thinking, where the hell am I? And I told the guy, you can't do that. And he told me with no uncertain terms to go F myself. And I thought, well, this is interesting. And I chased him around the playground, and nothing happened. And I remember thinking, who is this boy? And it turns out he only turned up once every 3 weeks to deal drugs in the classroom. And I thought, well, this is a great job I've taken. And I remember there was another girl in that class, and I've written about her, and I call her Carly. She's not called Carly. She had a big scar down her face where her dad had cracked her with a bottle when she was about 4 years old. Her mum and dad were alcoholics and drug dealers and so on. And she went home every night to this hell home. And she crept out before her mum and dad were awake in the morning. And she crept in afterwards when they were in a drunken stupor. And she spent most of her day at school or with her friends, a lovely friend's house that helped her to do her homework and nurtured her and so on. And she was the best student in the class, and she was so clever and she was so bright. And I remember once in one of my chaotic lessons, I just started teaching, and she said, "Sorry, have you got any work for us?" I said, really, I felt really bad. My God, I can't believe I've been failing so much here. And when I left that school, which was only 3 months, it was a 3-month placement. And I just said to her, "Carly, you are such an amazing student. I'm so proud of you. You're going to do so well." And obviously I didn't allude to her background because it would be impolite. I just said, "You've done so well." And I said, why is it you work so hard in such a chaotic environment? And she said, "Because I want to get out. Because I want to get out." She wanted to escape this hell that she was in. And she did. She went to university, and I promise she's brilliantly, happy ending. My point is this, is that risk factors are not destiny. And that when we ignore risk factors, then we make an extremely uber conservative mistake of thinking that everyone can succeed no matter what, and it's a lovely dream, and it's true in many circumstances, and people can, but that these socioeconomic risk factors have got a huge impact. To answer the second part of your question, have recent changes caused differences and difficulties? What I will say is this: is that when you're in a classroom and there is no common understanding of what good conduct means, and that there are different levels of acceptability in terms of how we interact with one another, you frequently have difficulties. Now, this happens between people from different families, people who come from different friendship groups, let alone national status, or gender or ethnicity or anything like that. So this is common to the human experience, that when we have different expectations, it can often be difficult to navigate. So, for example, different expectations of how women are treated in different cultures, and so on. But this is not new to the human experience. I mean, for instance, Britain has always been a nation of migrants. I mean, for centuries and centuries, because we're an island nation. And there's this kind of myth that we're some kind of, mono-ethnic core. We've always been Jutes and Angles and Saxons and Vikings and Danes and Scots and Celts and so on, right? So there's always been that kind of issue. But I may just say that in any classroom, the role of the teacher is to say to the kids, welcome to this classroom. This is our space. This is our subculture here. This is community as a subculture. These are our values in this classroom, and these are our behaviours. And those values shouldn't be particularly controversial. They should be things like caring about one another and sharing and trying to participate if you can in helping one another and working really hard and, you know, and celebrating success. These are international values. And when you get children from different backgrounds, for example, one of the things we see is, you know, the famous, you know, the Asian miracle of children who come from Southeast Asian cultures who then come to, you know, for instance, UK or America and so on, and, you know, and famously outstrip everybody else. So differences in cultures by themselves don't necessarily mean you know, any difficulties more than what we would normally expect in classrooms of people from different socio-economic circumstances. The job of the teacher is the same. This is who we are, and this is what we do. I get quite cross when people say, oh, you need to have different behavioural expectations for people from different backgrounds. I think we need to provide different levels of support for people who are struggling with different types of behaviour. But people from all around the world, any culture and any environment can learn, you know, the social habit of being punctual, of doing your best, of being literate and so on. And I get really annoyed at if I'm honest, the implicit racism of some people who say that some people can't behave because of the group they come from. That drives me mad. And I wish people didn't feel quite so bold about saying that, because sometimes it's quite vulgar, the way in which people say this, as if they're being the good guy. And I just feel like saying, whoa, think about what you're actually saying there. You know, people are people. Human beings have got a very finite level of psychology, spectrum of psychology. You know, we are genetically pretty much identical. And to say that, oh no, there's some group that can't do this is essentially to undermine them and treat them with less dignity than a human being. I digress. Or maybe I didn't.
Tom, Daniel asks, to what extent does a progressive turn in education contribute to some of the teacher preparation, frankly, and also teaching practices that you've described that maybe might have contributed to poorer classroom management skills?
I don't know where to even begin with this. Progressive education is the enemy of children's education. Progressive education is the opposite of what we should be doing. If you want a really good guide of what we should do in education, do the opposite of what people like Freire and Dewey say, and Rousseau, and just do the opposite of that. Now, this idea, as we alluded to earlier on, that children learn best by themselves is madness, and it dooms children to a life of inequality. It widens the disadvantage gap. So all those people who are hopping mad about social justice can just sit down when it comes to advocating those types of reforms, because that makes things worse. If you want children to be safe, if you want them to learn, if you want the disadvantage gap to be narrowed, then run your bloody classroom. Because the children from the most advantaged circumstances are already brimming with these social skills, statistically speaking, proportionally speaking. And the children from less advantaged circumstances need more support in order to achieve the equity of opportunity, access, and outcome that we're also animated by. And progressivism is absolutely core to the undermining of children's education. And teacher preparation or teacher induction or teacher training internationally has been drenched in this manure that we have seen. Incidentally, I want to be quite clear here. I have seen many brilliant teacher preparation programs. Well, I've seen a few. I've seen many brilliant teacher inductors and lecturers and so on. I work with them, and they are my tribe, and I love them. I'm not knocking the whole sector, but what I'm saying is that the sector in general has been dominated by ideological assumptions, and I guess you would call it virtue signaling, of fashionable, polite ideologies which have no place in the classroom whatsoever. And a lot of this is because a lot of the academics involved in teacher preparation programs cannot even remember being in a classroom, and that children to them are just ideological constructs in their theoretical diagram of what it would be really nice if children were like. That cannot be sustained. And we've started to see an explosion of that in the UK. And there's some brilliant teacher prep programs. But progressivism has been, in my mind, the petri dish of reinfection here. Because every single cohort of teachers that comes through gets burdened with these ridiculous ideas about, oh, they must all be working in groups, or they've got to co-construct their knowledge, or they should be working thematically in projects. This is hell for children. particularly the least advantaged children. And teachers who try all this rubbish, try with it for a while and here's what happens. They kind of half give up. And they realize that sometimes, you know what, kids need to be looking at me. Sometimes kids need to be doing individual work. Sometimes they need to be quiet. And sometimes it'd be really good if they weren't hitting each other. And what they end up with a kind of a compromise where they do lots of stuff that is sometimes called neo-traditionalism, right? But they feel guilty about it. And whenever they're inspected, they do loads of group work and loads of exploring tasks and so on. Free, fly, be free, my beautiful butterflies. And everyone just keeps up the pretense. Enough. It's all going to change. We're doing some stuff to try and change that here in the UK. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll get there. Like Moses, I may not see the promised land, but hopefully we'll get there. But progressive education, mark my words, is the kryptonite for what children actually need in order to flourish, thrive, and be safe. I don't know if I'm clear enough there.
Oh, I don't know. It was a bit ambiguous, I think.
I'll come off the fence in a minute.
Erin's got a specific question within schools. She asks, how much time do you think school staff should spend discussing behavioural norms and expectations to ensure that everyone is across what the expectations and processes are? I guess this is one of the issues, isn't it? That individual teachers may have a level of expectation, but how do you generalise that in a school environment, school-wide?
Individual teachers can do so much. I remember talking to Catherine Burbelsing. I don't know if your audience has heard of Catherine Burbelsing, but she runs like the strictest school in the UK. She's brilliant. I mean, she's bonkers, but she's amazing. There's a chip of insanity inside her that drives her genius. And she's not exactly a wallflower when it comes to being outspoken. But I tell you what, she's one of the best head teachers I've ever seen in my life. Her school is extraordinary. The kids love it. They flourish. They succeed. And they're happy. And she said to me that, and I agree with this, that it's possible to have great behaviour in a chaotic school. It is possible. In the same way that it's possible to be a great doctor in a war zone, but you're not a great doctor because of your circumstances of the war zone. And if you're a teacher in a chaotic school, you can still have great behaviour, but you have to work 10 times harder to get it. You've got to be on your expectations, on your standards, on your reprimands, on your praise, on your systems, on your processes, on your norms, constantly. You can never relax, and you have to fight the same battles over and over again. So ideally, the school would be the nurturing environment which provides the mechanisms by which this happens. The main mechanism by which schools can affect the culture of the school is staff training. First of all, the leaders need to have a clear understanding, what do we mean by good behaviour? Nothing woolly, nothing fuzzy. What do I want the kids to do? What do I want the teachers to do? What's good behaviour for my staff? Where do I want them to be? How do I want them to do a parents' evening? How do I want them to manage corridor conduct? How do I want them to manage a classroom? That's why leaders get paid the big bucks and get all the glory, he says ironically, because it's a bloody hard job to be a leader, because that's your job, to make sure the culture is clear. You then teach it to the staff, and then the staff teach it to the children. And as the staff are teaching it to the children, we're both learning. Everyone's learning. But the best way to do this is by front-loading it. So staff who come to school need to have a really thorough formal induction into, this is the school's behaviour policy, this is what we want you to do. And this is what we want you to do if this happens, and if this happens, and if this happens. And the beauty of that is that the teachers then know, well, at least I should do this. And if they do it, and the school then says to them, we notice you're doing lots of suspensions or something like that, the teacher can quite rightly say, well, what do you want me to do? Because this is what you told me to do. What do you want me to do? Do you want me to be magic? Do you want me to have hypnosis? And the teacher induction program, Glenn, years and years ago, before I was a teacher, before I ran nightclubs, I used to work at TGI Fridays. I was a bartender there. I blame late stage capitalism for my own lack of success. And one of the things that we did there, I did a philosophy degree, I was unemployable. One of the things that we did there was I had a 2-week classroom induction, wearing my novelty stripes and braces and cowboy hat to learn about cocktails and how to upsell fajitas and how to answer the phone and what to do for customers. 2 weeks. And this is why things like that, like them or hate them, why these franchises are sustainable and successful, because they know who they are. They know their processes, churches are often quite good at this. The army's really good at this. The Hilton's really good at this. These are all commercial examples, which I'm sure will delight people. But people that know their culture can replicate their culture and sustain it. And I've done lots of work with these institutions, and it's interesting to see the comparisons there. And then in school, you propagate your culture by, first of all, really clearly and explicitly teaching it. to people. And then as new people join the institution, they make sure they get that induction process as well. And then make sure that that line management and leadership are constantly making sure that staff are doing what they said they should do. And that should be seen as a supportive mechanism. No teacher should be allowed to let a kid, walk in the wrong side of the corridor or drop litter or punch somebody or swear or run away and get away with it. Every teacher should know what to do in that situation. And if they don't do it, the line manager's job is to make sure they're doing it, which can sometimes mean some challenging conversations, but ultimately supportive conversations. And the schools with the best behaviour cultures I've ever seen, teachers love working in them. They don't think, oh my God, we live in something from 1984. They go, this is brilliant. My kids are safe. They're learning. I'm happy. We all go home happy. The kids say they love it. I love it. It's a win-win situation. And I wish we could get past this kind of dogmatic anti-pragmatism of ideological boneheadedness that drives us to anything other than what I've just described.
Tom, we're just about out of time, and I've got a final question for you. It's a two-part question. The first part comes from an audience member, Mark, who asks, "Can you please be our Minister for Education Australia-wide?" And secondly, if not, what advice would you give to our policymakers if they're to raise classroom management and improve behaviour in our schools?
Sure. Mark, they know where I am. They have my number. I don't know if I could take the grief. Actually, I get enough grief as it is, so maybe I could. Thank you very much. The second thing I would say is that advice for Australia, I've got to be so careful here. The last thing you want is some POM. Am I a POM? A Scottish? Am I a POM? I don't know.
Complicated, yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Okay. Am I oppressed or oppressor? I don't know. So it's really difficult. I follow the Australian scene quite a bit because of commentators I listen to. Ironically, one of my favourite Australian commentators is Greg Ashman, who I know is a friend of CIS. People like Jennifer Buckingham and so on. And academics like Sweller and so on. So, I follow Greg's blog quite closely, and he's quite vocal and open about it. But I wouldn't say I know enough about the systems and processes to suggest I should tell you what to do. Here is some feedback, though, if you're interested, which is that I understand that your education systems are divided by state. There's not some kind of big nationwide mandatory stipulation as to how things are done. I think there seems to have been some really good progress made over the last 5 years or so in terms of things like phonics. The use of phonics and so on. I think that there has been. My sense is, I'm going to be very careful and cautious how I say this, is that some of the issues that we face in the UK are similar to some of the issues that you face in Australia, which is, for example, a progressive ideological stranglehold over many of the gates by which you get into the profession. And many of the people who advise government ministers and so on tend to still be in these types of roles. I think there tends to be there's still a priesthood, if I may say so. And I know because I keep butting up against it. Whenever we have researcher events, I literally get people saying, how dare you say things like children should behave? How dare you say that children should learn stuff? Learning is immoral. Learning is oppressive, and stuff like that. And I've done research eds in New Zealand as well, and it's been, I very much sense there's still this strong priesthood. But the great thing about priesthood is that their idols are false, and that the reason why they push back so hard against evidence-informed education is that they know that ultimately they've got very little up their sleeve, but smoke and mirrors and murties and other false deities, and that they know that when challenged they've got very little response, and they'll throw smoke in your face and call you a fascist, or you're a horrible, evil person, or you had somebody at your conference once that I disagree with. How dare you? You must be about it. It's all this. They go so low and they become so personal. So I would suggest that if you can somehow make sure the teacher training courses are evidence informed as much as possible, and some of them are, then that would be a great way to go, because that is how you break the cycle of future generations being compelled to succumb to this weird, fuzzy ideology that we've all labour under.
Well, that's all we have time for today. To be continued, I'm sure. From everyone here at CIS, a big thanks to you, Tom, for your time and insights.
Glenn, thank you so much for having me. And thank you to everyone who came along. I mean, I presume you weren't forced to come here. So thank you for listening, either listening now or in the future. And if you are in the future, hello to the future. I hope you have jet bikes. Thank you very much. Take care, Glenn.
Now, for decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice, working tirelessly to deliver evidence-based public policy, especially in the critical area of education. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. CIS relies solely on the generosity of people like you to help us advance our cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.